ASU, and now you're there for gender studies, or women in gender studies. Some departments have different names. I'm not used to it. My undergrad called it gender studies. My current school just calls it women's studies still. So, what if you were you've been a writer, probably you were a writer probably in that transition. What led you to pursue that track as a graduate student, as opposed to maybe pursuing your writing more or your English more?
Well, that's been an interesting sort of journey, figuring out what I wanted to do, because writing is definitely something that I'm very passionate about, and I think it's something I want to keep pursuing for the rest of my life, and I really would like to publish my fiction someday. But for me, even with my undergrad, I think what the biggest benefit I got from studying literature as opposed to creative writing, and this is for me personally, because I definitely think there's benefits to both as a writer, I felt that learning how to read things critically and sort of reading the classics and learning how to talk about literature really helped me as a writer to sort of be self-reflective and think about my writing from the reader's perspective. And as far as women's studies goes, I think it's sort of a similar thing. Is for me, a big part of my writing is in creating diverse characters and sort of taking stories that maybe aren't told as often. Like, just to go back to what I'm working on right now is I love coming of age stories, like all those like 80s movies about like a bunch of like 12-year-old boys going on some crazy adventure. I love all of those.
You must love Stranger Things then.
Oh my God, I love Stranger Things. Yeah, definitely. But one thing that I've noticed for years is that it's so hard to find a story like that with a group of girls. And I just thought about, my childhood growing up and all my friends, like the stuff we would do, and if we were in those situations, like we had the opportunity to just wander off into the woods or whatever, like these kids do, we totally would have. And so, just like this idea of like, why aren't there stories like that about girls? So things like that have always been stuff that I'm passionate about with my writing. And I feel like a women's studies degree will help me sort of see stories outside of my own sort of limited perspective of whose voices aren't being heard, whose stories aren't being told, and how can I help tell those stories as a writer, or maybe help represent those people as an editor. So that's sort of been my mindset going into my grad degree.
Yeah, and I mean, for goodness sakes, the genres you seem to be writing in, the fantasy or more horror stuff, they're not safe places for female characters.
Yeah.
And and you've just read it, so you know how well that book handles its female characters.
Yeah.
And it's something that I also write in those genres, and I worry about it too. It's something people should be more conscious of. And it doesn't ruin anyone's writing to be doing that. And it's really cool that you're doing that. We're getting an all-female Lord of the Flies remake.
Yeah, I've heard about that.
Which is
about that.
Yeah, I don't think it's gonna work. But however, I think Stand By Me, on the other hand, or even It, those kind of things could work with an all-female cast. So it's cool that you're working on that. It's very Hollywood. I like it.
Yeah, I think a lot of the stuff that I'm inspired by ends up being like movies and TV shows. I really like, just because I think in undergrad I had more time to watch a movie than I did to read a book for fun.
Mm-hmm.
So I definitely have noticed that's had an influence on the kind of stories that I'm drawn to writing are more Hollywood.
Yeah, and I'm the same way. And you mentioned, the importance of literature, and I'm an MFA student, but I love the program I'm in because it's a studio academic, so I'm still getting to take literature courses, and and it's something, if you read Stephen King or any Gaiman or any writers who are asked constantly for writing advice, the big one they say is that, regardless of what I say about any sort of technique, if you're not reading, then your writing's never going to get better.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So I like that that you're kind of sticking to that mantra, because it does lead to better writing.
Yeah, I think I noticed that I was sort of struggling for inspiration while I was in undergrad because I wasn't really reading anything that wasn't an assigned book because I just had so much. So this past year, sort of while I didn't have school, even though I'm in school now, but for a majority of this year, I didn't really have anything going on. I sort of made it my goal to read 24 books this year. And I feel like that's sort of why I had the motivation to write as much as I have this year, is because reading helps you sort of see like how other authors are putting stories together, and it sort of sparks that inspiration. So yeah, I definitely think reading is so important if you want to write.
Yeah. And the nice thing about grad school is that, especially when you're working within possible queer feminist readings, is that you can always find any book you want and apply that theory to it in some way.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, absolutely. I do that all the time.
So your day job, quote unquote, because it's hard to say you have a day job when you're a student,
Mm-hmm.
is that you're the editor at editor for the marketing department. How did that come about as sort of a result of your experience writing, or?
So it was actually sort of I was a student employee for during my undergrad at the marketing department for ASU, and it was the job I had all 4 years as a student, and then I was lucky enough that they had an opening when I graduated on the editing team, which was where I was working as a student worker. And so I was just really excited to take on a job that, first of all, I was familiar with, and it was also still involved in editing and writing, even though marketing writing is very different from fiction. But it's still giving me experience in the aspects of editing that are my favorite, which is basically helping somebody else get their message across in the best way possible. That's sort of what I view the job of an editor as, is to help somebody tell their story, or, tell their email about signing, or signing up for classes or whatever it is, how to get that information across in the best way possible. So, even though it's a very different kind of writing and, a different kind of editing, I think it still has been useful. I've learned a lot of useful things just about how to look critically at writing, and as an editor especially, because that's definitely something I want to pursue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've spoken with a few editors, and it really does. It's a thing that I think a lot of writers should try, because it's another thing that puts more tools in your toolbox.
Oh, definitely.
And you've also worked so the Superstition Review, is that ASU's like in-house journal, or?
Yeah, it's one of several. I'm not sure the names of all of the ones that we have, but this one specifically is almost entirely staffed by undergraduate interns, and you get class credit for it, which is great. And it's super flexible because a lot of it is online, so it's a really great experience for undergrads to sort of learn how a literary magazine works. And so I was one of the interview editors, so I had to basically find contemporary literary fiction authors who'd published in the last couple of years and reach out to them, and then set up an interview and conduct an interview through email, and then sort of piece it together so it read nicely. And so that was really interesting because I sort of got to see some of the contemporary fiction authors who are out there and what they were writing about, because I had to read some of the works of the people I was interviewing. So I had, context for what I was interviewing them about. But yeah, that was also a very interesting sort of way to approach writing, because I'm talking to other authors about their writing and trying to find new questions to ask them that they haven't been asked 100 times already, things like that.
I understand that struggle.
Yeah, sure.
Let's see. So it looks like you've, when it comes to your current writing, you're currently working on one for Nano, but your previous Nano one, you've finished a draft of it, and you've been going through multiple drafts. What was that? What was that process like, going from a Nano piece to getting it closer to a finished product?
It's intimidating at first to sort of sit down with it. I remember when I finished, because I sort of told myself, like, don't even try to go back and like edit things until you're done. Like, just finish it first and then go back. So it was like 2:00 in the morning, and I was like, I'm on the last chapter, like I'm typing it all out. It's like very emotional, like typing out that last page, because I'd been working on this for so long, and it was huge. It was over 100,000 words by that point. So then once I finished, sort of going back and looking at it from the beginning, which I had started, months ago, and being like, well, now I have to read this all again and see what's inconsistent, what's wrong, like how do I make this not suck? So it was definitely overwhelming at first, but one thing that I did that I think was super helpful for me, at least, because reading that much text on a screen was just very difficult, is I went to, I believe it's lulu.com. There's a few different websites that sort of self-publish, and Nano has sort of partnerships with some of them from time to time. And so I just ordered a paperback copy of my manuscript, like unedited. It was less than $10. And then I had this thing that looked like a real book, and so I could physically touch it and see it and write in it and sit with it and read and see how things flowed. And that made it so much easier to sort of start editing, to have this physical, tangible thing that I could work with. And also enlisting the help of anybody who I could force to read even part of my giant book. I would send it to my friends and be like, please tell me what you think of this. Does this make sense? And that was helpful. It's always hard to share your work when it's not perfect and like it's nowhere close to perfect. So, cause they had comments like, oh, this doesn't make sense. I don't understand this whole section. What's the relevance of this? And, there's always that little bit of ego, like your ego just crumbles a little bit. But I definitely think those were the two big things that helped me sort of tackle that initial edit, because after that it became so much easier once I'd gone through it all once and sort of cleaned it up a little bit. Then going back through and doing further revisions felt easier, because I knew that the base was a little bit more solid.
Yeah, and that's always tough once you get, I know a lot of authors who can fall into the trap of, they get their book physically and it's hard to, you're like, oh, it's on paper now, it must be fine. You have it in your hand and it's like your baby's real.
Yeah.
It's hard to keep going. It's people do, and I have, but it's difficult to do that. 'Cause it feels done when it's, because like books are supposed to be on paper, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it's funny because I've actually ordered 2 different copies of it. I ordered my most recent draft of it to give to my family, because I have some siblings who are around the age range of my intended audience for the book, so I wanted them to read it. But the first draft I ordered,